Hello everyone, this is Bonfire Madigan. We're not crazy, the system is. Tune into the Radical Mental Health Show hosted by the Freedom Center, Wednesday nights, 6 to 7 p.m. on Valley Free Radio, WXOJ 103.3 FM.
And this is Will Hall. I'm hosting the Freedom Center Mental Health Show tonight. We have I'm really excited about our guest tonight. A lot of you have heard on previous shows and through the various events that the Freedom Center has done on our website. We always talk about this project, the Soteria House, which was an experimental alternative residence in California, which really showed that alternative non-drug approaches, humane approaches, would produce better outcomes. And this is really one of the great shining examples of alternative humanitarian non-drug approaches to dealing with psychosis and schizophrenia. And so I actually last year was at an event, and the former clinical director, Voyce Hendrix, was at the event, and I was really impressed by him. And so we've got him on the line. Voyce was clinical director of the Soteria project and also the follow-up project that was done to replicate the results of the Soteria project. He worked closely with Dr. Loren Mosher, and he was also the co-author of the NIH report on Soteria. Okay, well, we've got Voyce Hendrix on the line. Welcome to the Mental Health Show on Valley Free Radio.
Well, glad to be here. In fact, I'm kind of excited to be able to talk about this.
So you've got a little bit of experience with community radio, is that right?
Yes, right. I work for it's called In Your Backyard. It's sort of a local news here, and also did a lot of sort of committee work and stuff at Word Radio, which is Madison's local community radio.
So you're calling us from Madison, Wisconsin?
Yeah, right now.
That's actually really interesting. Some of the folks who helped get Valley Free Radio off the ground years and years ago were actually folks who worked with WORT in Madison, Wisconsin. So there's a Madison connection here at Valley Free Radio. Well, I imagine that a lot of people don't really know much about what the Soteria project was, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that. But I just kind of wanted to get a sense of, how did you get involved in mental health? I know you worked in more mainstream mental health before you got involved with the Soteria project. Is that right?
Yes, right. Yeah, I worked actually back in the old days when when we think about state hospitals. I worked there. There's a place called Agnes State Hospital in San Jose, one of the large. I think, from what I gathered, probably about like 4,000 beds, large. That's where I did my training. I was a psych tech, which essentially you got trained at the state hospitals, and you essentially got a nursing background. Would be pretty much like a registered nurse, not quite an RN, but you also got the psych background. So essentially, you worked on the units pretty much like a nurse. Mm-hmm.
And I guess you do some of like the restraint and some of the more force kind of stuff was something that, yeah.
Yeah, but it's also it's an interesting way to sort of come into Soteria, because you're really coming in from and to be fair about it, state hospitals, most state hospitals, have a bad reputation, but Agnes has a lot of training too. Mm-hmm. But so in that sense, at the time, you would think of it as being the state of the art, but what that means, it could be
right. And this was
art of what.
This was in the 70s and early 80s. Is that right?
Yeah, I started at 60. It makes me seem old. 65 through 71. Because Soteria opened. It was, I think, June the 5th in 71.
And you said Agnew was in San Jose. That's in California, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay. So you were involved, you were working in the mainstream system. Then how did you sort of make a transition? How did you get involved in the Soteria project?
Yeah, essentially, personally, I grew up in college, had nothing to do with mental health. As far as the thing, I had no idea about state hospitals, about mental health at all. I took a psychology class, I think it was Psychology 101 or something, one of the first year, I think, in college. But that was my only kind of entry into mental health. Mm-hmm. But I grew up in high school. I was a pole vaulter. In fact, I took first place in a state meet in California. So, I mean, I saw myself more like an athlete until I got drafted in the Army, which sort of ended all that, football. I fully came out a different person.
Wow, so this was the Vietnam War.
Yeah, it was just before the Vietnam War. In fact, I worked in the office, and we were sending out people to different places in the Middle East. That there's this code name. They had no idea what that was. It was going somewhere, and they never heard. In fact, the name Vietnam came up, and I think, Vietnam, where's that? So it was early, just before the war became sort of public, and then I was discharged. And when I came out, I totally was at a totally different place. I had no interest in athletics, and I became a professional musician.
Wow. So you got more interested in music, and how were you changed? I mean, sort of like it was a big life-changing experience.
I think military. There's something about the Army experience that suddenly, grows you real quick. I mean, you suddenly become adult very quick, and realizing that for me personally, this is very different than it is now, because this is the all volunteer Army. But when I was in the Army, it was the people were there were being actually drafted. So I was drafted just before, I guess it was one of the Berlin crisis, and I was at a short period where you couldn't get a deferment, even though I was in college. So most of the folks that came in with me were all draftees, and they were not really military type. So what you got is the career military type, and then you had us who were drafted. So you really got a different experience than you do now. And for me, I mean, the Army was never my thing. But back then, but this is before people were running off to Canada. So you got drafted, you went, and I spent 2 years and came out. So it was a very different experience to me. So when I came back, I was on the road as a musician, and what happened actually was about a year on the road, and one night I remember waking up in a hotel and not having a clue where I was or what I was doing. It's one of those kind of experiences you kind of, because all these hotels are the same. And so I find myself deciding, I can't do this anymore. This is not who I am. And so I sort of ended my music career as music as my, who I am. And I decided, I will do something else in my life. So I went. My girlfriend was working at a state hospital, and she suggested that I, something to do. And that's how I actually got involved in state hospital. At Porterville State Hospital, which was a hospital at the time called a hospital for retarded. I think it changed. This would have been about. This was in '65. Yeah.
So you mentioned becoming a musician. I'm afraid I have to bring this up, but aren't you're related to Jimi Hendrix,
yes,
right?
We're second cousins.
Second cousins.
Yeah, our grandfathers are brothers.
Wow. Okay, so maybe some musical talent running in the family.
I think it was more. I was a music major in college. With so much talent, there was said, to spend 8 hours a day practicing. So we both come from the same family. He's from more the Washington, and I was his California part. The families didn't really interact at all. In fact, I didn't meet anyone from the family until probably the 90s.
So what was your impression of working in the mainstream system, and then how did you sort of get connected to this alternative program?
It was a couple what happened, the reason for me going to Soteria, which is interesting because there's a program at Agnes State Hospital which Loren was involved, a research project. It was a double-blind medication study. Essentially what they did is they took clients who came in at admission at Agnes, and I worked at admissions, the reason why I had the contact with them, and they would assign them to a placebo or I'm not sure what medication at the time. I don't know all the details. And it was interesting. The unit was bought. I think it would probably be like 68 to 69 when it started, and it had a profound impact on the hospital itself. Because when that program started, a lot of young people who wore beards and wore normal clothes. And at the time, Agnew's staff, folks like me, wore whites, and the females wore those nursing hats and things, like they did in the olden days. But this unit started to work, and people came into work like you would, be at home. And the reputation of people working in that unit was that, there was these hippie types, strange folks. Within a year and a half, the hospital shedded their clothes, and you could wear a beard. It almost that unit transformed the hospital instead of the hospital transformed the unit.
And what was the actual study that was being done?
The study is called the Rappaport study. It was essentially, and it's the interesting about it that everybody who worked there, including me, because the reason why it had a bad reputation with the admission unit, and I'm the one who really worked with them a lot because I was friendly, so I spent a lot of time there. But all the staff knew who was taking medication, who wasn't. At the end of the study, it was almost totally the opposite. The people who we knew were on medication were not on medication, and it's an interesting study. I don't have a copy of it or anything, but if you can, I'm not sure if you can even get it now. But it's called Rappaport study. I've seen it. I don't know if you know Mad America, the book by Robert Whitaker.
Oh yeah.
I think he mentions it there,
so it
must be around somewhere.
So it was a very innovative result, and it really kind of
very innovative result. Also, a good friend of mine who became later a good friend of mine was David Rosenhan. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
He did a book, a research project out of Stanford. It was called Being Sane in Insane Places.
Okay, where the graduate students posed as mental patients.
So these things were all going on all about the same time. That started a little later, and then so what happened with that contact with that unit, I met Loren, and when Loren started, got the proposal and got the funding to do his study, the Soteria study, he asked me was I interested, and there's a couple of things that happened right at the same time that really kind of dramatically changed. I was going to quit altogether and go off and do something totally different. But it made me stay in the field and go to Soteria. There was an incident at the unit, and it was a young kid who was admitted, probably, I was suspecting, maybe 21, around 21. I remember coming on the unit and seeing him sitting, gesturing, and sort of smiling to himself and sort of laughing and making gesture. And when I got on the unit, I went into the nurse's station and was greeted by the head nurse at the time, who said he was very upset about that client being out there unmedicated and why he was out there making the gestures, so clearly need medication and stuff. And we talked about it, and then the night nurse, because it was a change of shift, pulled the med down, a shot out, and we went out to approach him to give him the shot. And I remember his response was he immediately stopped, the kind of smiling, and was very rational. Said, I don't want the medications, and by the way, I'm allergic to whatever the medication was. And we went back in the unit, and I said, there's no. She looked in the chart. I can remember this very clearly. She looked in the chart. There was nothing in the chart that he was allergic to medication. Of course, the information they got in the chart came from him. Probably be about an hour for it because they just admitted him. And then we went out, and it was clear we were going to get a shot. He took off, and we had to do the normal things you do in state hospitals, chase him down, hold him down, and give him the shot. It turned out he was allergic to the shot. He wound up being accused, and he bit a large part of his arm off. He bit it off. It just hung out of his arm. And that was kind of a vivid thing. To me, I didn't realize this until much later when you go back and look at it, think about it. But it disturbed me, and I wasn't clear why. Something wrong. I just, learn my my nursing and all that. But there's not something wrong with this process that didn't make sense. Because he wasn't doing anything, he wasn't hurting anybody. But clearly, after the process of giving him medicine, he was himself hurt. But he did it himself or not. He was hurt. And so later on, after about a couple of years of Soteria, I could go back and sort of revisit that, and it was clear that the person, I don't know if he was upset or not. I mean, he didn't look like he said he wasn't upset. He was smiling. He wasn't doing anything, but the fact that the nurse was really upset.
Yeah.
And when we dealt with him instead of her being upset. Yeah, and that, Soteria, that would have been the issue. If I would have come into Soteria one morning and someone was there, seeming like they were enjoying themselves or whatever, and I'd say that we need to do something about this because I'm upset, they would have pointed out to me, the staff and the clients there would have pointed out to me that I was upset, not the person.
Right.
And that didn't happen there. It took a couple of years to figure that out. But it's that kind of thing. There was several of those things that said, well, maybe Loren was talking about doing all these strange, innovative things. Maybe that would be, something to get involved with. I lost a couple of $100 in pay back then. It was a lot of money.
So you took a cut in pay to go and work with Soteria.
Quite a bit. I was just passed the supervisor's test and was going to become a supervisor, which would have made even more of a dramatic test. But I was going to leave anyway. I was, thinking about doing other things. But so that, to me, those kinds of things, there were several of those things that happened right within that last month that made me decide to go to Soteria, get involved with Loren.
So tell us about what exactly was the Soteria project and how was it set up, and also maybe give us a little bit of background on Loren Mosher as well. Folks may not know who he is.
Yeah, Loren Mosher he was the chief of study of schizophrenia at the NIMH at the time,
which is kind of like the highest research.
Yeah, pretty
position.
much. I think, as I understand, pretty much would be sort of the top person in the field. Psychiatrist, in terms of public service at least. And he had spent a year in London at Kingsley Hall. Are you familiar with Kingsley Hall?
That's R.D. Lang's experimental community
program. And essentially, and as he explained to us at the time, that Kingsley Hall was this place where these folks could, having mental health issues, and could go to and sort of live. It's sort of an asylum in a sense. There were people there who were what they call friends of Kingsley Hall, but they didn't have any kind of staff status or anything like that. They just be there and be supportive and do their own thing. So for Loren, he saw things happening there. He saw people going through processes without medication and coming out on the other end. He saw people using medications and seeing their therapists outside of the house, Kingsley Hall, and doing well. A lot of people not doing well too. But overall, he saw a therapeutic community. People were being helped. So, Loren was very clear about it. He had he couldn't explain exactly what was going on and why people were getting better, why people not. But clearly people were getting better in general. And so what he did, he came back to the States, excuse me, and decided to do a study using some of what he saw at Kingsley Hall and some of his own, own stuff. So when he came back, the problem you have is how do you replicate something like that in states? Because you're in two different countries with the cultures are different. First thing, you're not going to get a grant to pay for a program that doesn't have staff, which is Kingsley Hall.
Right, that would be a problem, huh?
Yeah, right. I mean, some of just the logistics of it would be problematic. So what happened? How do we design this? So you design and it's kind of vague. The original proposal in terms of what the staff was going to do was something like having a couple who would live there at the house and have staff who would come in, and then you would deal with how to sort of the problems you saw with the issue of staff and how do we get around those issues. When the proposal was written up, it was written up in some vague way that that sort of implied this supportive couple would be actually in the house. So the reality is, the first day when we all showed up to really actually opened Soteria and started working on it, we were all sitting at the table. I can't recall this, sitting looking at each other. What are we going to do? I mean, there really was no clear instructions about what to do. They had these sort of vague ideas at Kingsley Hall, and we did a lot of, actually within the first 2 weeks, we did a lot of training. We had psychiatrists and some other people who talked about. We had John, I remember blocking his name. He's the union. He was the head of the Union Society in California. John Perry.
John
right?
Weir Perry, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Who did a similar house called the Abbess's House. I think.
That's the results came out of Soteria. It's a part of Soteria history, actually. And then we went to Esalen. I don't know if you're familiar with Esalen Institute.
That's the sort of Human Potential Center on the coast there.
So we spent a week there sort of doing our thing and going to some of their stuff to sort of... So in general, what we were doing was sort of trying to, as a group, connect, but also trying to look at mental health in a very alternative ways of dealing with folks. So the reality is when we first opened, we decided we weren't going to deal with staffing at all. People would be there when they want to. People. We had the other things. We had like 3 or 4 staff who lived there. So it wasn't the shortest staff. In fact, the first month, everybody was there almost all the time, which proved problematic. The second month, everybody was burnt out. So we had this crisis. We need to deal somehow with some kind of staffing pattern. So what we did is decided to split the week up.
So how was it set up exactly in terms of, how many, you took, as I understand it, you took patients who had their first break of psychosis and put them in this setting.
The population. That was people. There were 7 criteria to determine if they qualified for the research project. And the first is the severity level. If they didn't come to Soteria, they were going to be hospitalized. The level. The severity had to be someone who really needed to be hospitalized. So the issue of danger to themselves, danger to others, are gravely disabled.
People who are in total psychotic, full-blown episodes.
People were really psychotic when they came to Soteria. They weren't people who were stable, that had gotten through it or not. I don't remember all 7, but things like they couldn't be alcohol and drugs, because that's, if you're an alcohol drug, it may be the issue of alcohol and drugs.
It would confuse the issues, yeah.
The other thing was they couldn't be married, because being married is a very, they have a lot better possibility of good outcome, because if you can establish relationships. Usually, essentially, what we're looking for were people who were at most risk to catch them at the beginning, but are at most risk of becoming chronic in the system.
And these are people who would get diagnosis of schizophrenia or paranoid schizophrenia or manic depressive or the really serious, the worst. When we think of people who have lost their minds and are really these are exactly the people who would just get massively medicated today.
And this is what we're looking for: people who are with the highest probability of becoming what we call chronic in the system. Now, this was before DSM-3. This was DSM-2. So it's not exactly where it would be now. It would be quite different in terms of, not really that quite different, but but it would be different in terms of diagnosis. So this, in terms of the population, it had to be someone between 18 and 35. I think there was an age thing. We're looking, and it had to be no more than 6 months of prior history of being mentally ill.
And what were some of the ways that you mentioned this sort of the kind of blurring of the staff role and the informality of it? What were some of the other ways that Soteria was different than a hospital setting? We mentioned that there was no medication used or very little medication.
We did use medications. The studies show different things. I'm not all clear on that because I've heard different things from the study. But the most common I hear is 8% of the people while in the 2-year, while at Soteria itself. And at the beginning it was usually about 5 months. and it really gradually went down to about a 3-month stay at Soteria itself when you first were admitted before you actually were discharged. I'll go into more detail because it's important. When I say discharge, there's a lot behind that word, discharge. But within that period, there's 8%, and then with the 2-year follow-up, it was like 16% of folks. 100% of the control group was at the county hospital. There was a control group. It was called a tripartite study. There were 3 groups of people studied. The one that went to Soteria, it was called the experimental group. The control group went to the county hospital and then went to the county system, the treatment, whatever the county did. The third group was people who came up to Soteria, but Soteria was full, it couldn't take them. And they would go through the same treatment as the second group, the county hospital group, because what they were worried about is that Soteria only had 6 beds, and if we somehow could take the best of the clients and, we could, so they studied the third group, who people we turned down, to make sure they weren't different.
I see. So they weren't sort of taking the more likely to recover.
Yeah, we weren't taking the good folks.
And what were the results you had said? The percentage of people who sort of got better and compared to the control?
It's there in terms of, probably, if you think about it, it's pretty much. I would be real conservative. I have to be real conservative here. That it was probably not all that drastically different in the long run. The Soteria County Mental Health is a very good mental health center at the time, system. So it wasn't all that, but it was quite different, the outcomes of those folks. For instance, the folks who came through Soteria were, in terms of work, they tended to get jobs like pretty much anybody else. In fact, and it's pretty much like if you went out and got a job, or your friends helping you, it was done that way. Where county folks were done through, the mental health system and job stuff, that kind of thing. They tend to have less jobs and not long. It's not long term. It was sort of part-time jobs. Where Soteria folks got more like normal jobs, and that's where if you were at Soteria, you see the way people would go out job. We'd go to the paper and look at it, and we'd help people. Like they had problems getting up in the morning, dealing with those issues. But people went out and got normal jobs. In fact, one of the clients that I have contact with periodically, even since then, which is 30 years almost, works at a job in high-tech industry. He just told me he was just flying. He just got back from New York somewhere. A lot of our clients are out there working normally, and a lot of our clients actually wound up working in the mental health field itself. So that was quite different. And the fact that most of our folks did this without being on medication is a very important piece.
Especially when you add to the mix the risks and dangers of the medications themselves.
If you eliminate that, you eliminate it, especially with some of the new medications and some of the new side effects. With the Zyprexa coming out with the diabetes and stuff like that. If you could avoid a lot of that, that's a very powerful thing.
So Soteria really showed that there was this myth that you have to medicate people and that medication is the only way to go. Yeah.
I think the big thing about Soteria is that issue itself. That in fact that one of the things we have, and I think a part of it, a lot of it has to do with the resources we have in mental health. It's easier to medicate somebody. Yeah. In terms of the process, if you look at Soteria and the control group, the cost was almost within pennies.
So the costs were about the same.
Yeah.
Wow.
But you have to realize now medications are more expensive than it would have been then. So
so it would probably be cheaper now, actually, because of the price of medication.
It's hard to know. My problem is that we're not looking at this issue now. We're not doing the studies, and the big argument is you can't do studies. The IRBs won't let people do studies with people without getting medications because it's unethical. And I don't know if you looked at the New York Times. I think it was a couple of months ago, a guy, John Bola, who did his study at USC.
I was actually quoted in that story, actually.
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah, I was the non-medicated schizophrenic that they talked to. So
yeah, right. So I mean, I think that's not true, and I think a lot of this is politics and and economics. So, my issue is Soteria happened 30 years ago, and it's a legitimate argument at different times, but it's not it's a bad argument to say that we shouldn't be doing more of looking at alternatives to medication and other things. Because right now, I mean, if you just look at historically, I don't know if you read Robert Wick's book, Mad in America. If you look historically, we haven't gone very far.
Right.
Yeah, and even the things like the other countries, the non-industrialized countries, the WHO studies, and if you remember those, I mean, it shows that we don't do as well as people in these we think as backward countries, and they use a lot less medications than we do, but have better outcomes. The whole issue of what we call chronic schizophrenia, you don't see that in these other countries.
Right, but what we do see in the U.S., there was massive profits for pharmaceutical companies and a huge mental industrial complex. So that's really a lot of what's driving this, because, I mean, Loren, I guess, ended up basically being pushed out of the profession. He lost his position at the NIH, and the Soteria was not funded. I just want to let people know, if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Voyce Hendrix, who was the clinical director of the Soteria Project, which was an experimental residential treatment facility in California for folks with schizophrenia and other kinds of severe psychotic mental illness diagnoses. It really showed the effectiveness of not using drugs, medication. So, Voyce, I remember when I met you in New York, you told some stories about some of the things that went on at Soteria that really kind of showed how you guys worked that was different. And I was wondering if maybe you could just share with us some of those things and what you learned and some of the things that happened, how you interacted with clients, because it's very different than now, which is that if the patient is not just totally under control, they immediately increase their medication, and that wasn't the philosophy at Soteria.
Yeah, I think if you look at the traditional system, look at Soteria, one thing that really stands out is that at Soteria we tolerated what we associated with psychosis. Someone who's hallucinating, someone who's doing something. If he's doing something that's not hurting him, hurting anyone else, or that's like the person not eating, we tolerated it. And a lot of people go through the process without doing the medication. For a perfect example, you'll have a person who you realize Soteria is never locked, so we never had the option of keeping anybody Soteria if they didn't want to be there. So if a perfect example, someone who's extremely psychotic and felt would be unsafe out in the street, if that person walked out the door, someone would walk out the door with them. And in most cases, that's not a problem. You walk. One of the examples I can remember, person was hallucinating. This was a male who's he was in control, and he said, "I'm going, and I'm taking off because I don't want to be here anymore." And he walked out the door, and we felt it was clearly unsafe for him to do that. And so I walked out behind him, and he said, "Well, no, you can stay here." But no, I said, "Well, I feel uncomfortable, where you are at this point." And so he walked, and I sort of walked behind him for a while. We walked, and probably about after a mile or so, I sort of walked up to him, and then we started talking. We started talking about all kinds of things. And I don't remember the conversation, but we walked for at least 4 or 5 miles around town, and eventually we wound back up at the front door of Soteria, and went back in, and it was, he was over, and went back up and went upstairs and went to sleep.
Wow, I'm trying to imagine that scenario in a hospital setting now, and it's like there's no way.
Can you imagine the amount of time of walking around 5 hours? We weren't walking fast.
Right. It sounds like it was really about human relationships, really relating to people.
But it's that kind of commitment to somebody. Even though we think of people, when people are delusional stuff, that they're not in touch. That's not always true. And it takes a while of being with people going through that you get that sense. A perfect example of me. Another story was that when the first person we admitted at Soteria, we call it residence. She was this young, fairly attractive, probably 22 or 23-year-old woman that we admitted who was grossly psychotic at the time. And she was drooling, doing all kinds of things that you associate someone who was extremely psychotic. She came in and she was quite affectionate, which was kind of an interesting thing. We had this is the first person, so we had no idea what we were doing. Technically, we thought we talked like we knew what we were doing, but the reality is, when you're starting something like that, you don't. Soteria evolved to become what it was. At the beginning, it was complicated, and so we had the psychiatrist teaching us these the mental health technology. It was Melanie Klein, I think, is sort of a neo-Freudian therapist.
Object relations theory.
Yeah. So he was teaching us I can recall one night I'm sitting up in a sofa upstairs, and the doctors was with me. I mean, we didn't call him doctor. He was just one of the folks there. We were fairly loose with folks in the house. So he was teaching me this technique. Now, when she says this, you talk about good mommy, bad mommy. We interpret back to her. Right. So I'm sitting on the couch and she's laying against me, like just laying down there. We're extremely comfortable. It's only probably about 11 or 12 o'clock at night, and he's telling me what to do, and I'm doing. And suddenly I'm realizing I got this technique down, and I became very, like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and she's sort of sitting there mumbling something. I had no idea what she was talking about. This went on for a good hour and a half, and then it ended. Then we went on to 2 years later, at least 2 years, 2 or 3 years later. She comes back, very together. She lives in Palo Alto. She goes surfing. She's really got her life together. And we go. And I said, let's go. We go for our local restaurant. She and I go out to the restaurant and have lunch. And we start talking about and laughing about the good, back when she was there and all stuff. And suddenly she stopped. She stopped and looked at me and said, "Do you remember that night?" And you should have seen my face. The first thing is the fact that she remembered, in her state, that she could remember. I mean, I was embarrassed. The fact I'm sitting there and doing all, and she said, "No, that was the most comfortable. That was the best. One of the best days of my life. It was so comfortable, and and I had a hard time getting over my embarrassment about the fact that she could remember it. And then all of a sudden she stopped and she said, "What was that stuff you were talking about? You were really kind of strange. That stuff you were talking about, good mommy and bad mommy and stuff." It is just my kind of jaws dropped. I mean, just the fact that she remembered every detail of what happened. And that my assumption, it was comfortable, it was kind of, but the fact that she remembered a lot more than I could. And when I look at it through her eyes, who was the person who had reality going on at the time? I don't know what was going on in her head, but clearly what I was doing was not me. She was more herself. I was not.
You were following this sort of weird psychological theory you had been taught.
Yeah, and I was into it thinking I was doing some wonderful thing. And clearly the thing for her was the comfort, the fact that we were there, and it was comfortable for her, and she was enjoying thing. Where I was enjoying this thing, and I'm thinking I'm some great therapist, going to be some great therapist. And that changed, from that point on, those kinds of approaches and interventions made no sense in Soteria. It was clear it made no sense in Soteria. And it affected me, in a sense, that Soteria affected me as much as it affected any person who went to Soteria. A very different person for the experience.
How so? Was it more? Was like the human relationship part and the?
Yeah, it's fact that, what we do, especially as therapists, and that what we do, we think we have this thing that this person is broken and I'm fixed. And somehow I'm going to use my fixedness to fix her brokenness.
Right.
And it doesn't work that way. I can be who I am, and I can be there, and that person can use me or not use some of me for what they want and change who they are. But there's no way for me to do that to that person. And the reality is the person who's usually going through the thing will, in fact, do that. You take out, if you create a healthy social system, they will pick out of that community, a system, what they need to balance themselves. I don't believe that in terms, if you look at the mental health, I don't think that the brain is broken to begin with. I think what we see, these diagnoses, is that within the context of a normal brain, and brain has a capacity to do all kinds of things and function in all kinds of ways. And what we do as humans, we balance ourselves. When we get into a community, we adapt to the community. We adapt the values and we adapt the behaviors, and we do those changes. And I, if in general, I don't. And I say I don't know what schizophrenia is, and I don't think anybody else knows what schizophrenia is. I think these are labels that we have put together to sort of give us a way to sort of. I think humans can't survive in systems where they don't understand the rules. So you need to create some kind of reality and then work within that reality. And I think that's what's going on. And the brain has it's like if you cut your hand, you cut your arm or something, if you keep it clean and 90% it will clean itself and then heal itself.
So it's really relying on the self-healing capacity of individuals.
Yeah, so in some ways, the best thing, the most powerful thing we can do in the therapeutic setting is be there. Yeah. The fact that you're there. And one of the problems with most mental health systems now, we're not there. So you give the medication, and they're social isolated. And I think that's one thing we should look at these other countries where they're not. I think people are not institutionalized or with their family. The behaviors are sort of tolerated, and they go out in the community. The community itself is more flexible and allowing for these things. And I think, people go through it.
Voyce, we don't have a lot of time left over, but is there maybe another example or story you wanted to share from Soteria? I know there's so much. It was such a huge and important project and experience that you've been part of, but maybe we can try and get you back on the show sometime in the future. But I was wondering if you had other thoughts or an additional story.
It's hard to sort of put them together because it's hard, it's a different context for me, environment. But in terms of, like I say, what makes Soteria, I know what to talk about. One thing I think is critical about Soteria that never got in the research, is not even talked about if you look at research or look at even the stuff going in Europe, but it was what made Soteria, half of what 50% of the positive outcome in Soteria can be attributed to something that was never ever thought about before we started, and it never came out in research, is the Soteria community. Pretty much anyone who goes through Soteria was encouraged to come back to Soteria and be involved at some level. So what happened is there's a large, perfect example. When we closed Soteria in about 83, I think we decided to have a final get-together for all the folks. And I made a kind of unilateral decision, because I was the only one there left, to say, how are we going to contact folks? And I did an experiment. I called 5 people who I think who still in contact with folks after they left Soteria, because a clear community developed outside of Soteria, outside of the physical house itself. And I called 3 staff and 2 ex-residents. they were able to locate around 80% of the folks who went to Soteria.
Wow, so people really stayed in touch, and they formed lasting bonds and friendships. And
people, there were cases where people, I had one ex-resident who got, I know, at least 5 people full-time jobs, and it used probably around 12 people, come in and work part-time and stuff. Who he was a manager of a food, plant food thing. There's a lot of that kind of thing where people. We had a lot of our clients, for instance, we had a woman who was a secretary who would go out and she left the area, was discharged, and went back to her job. And when something would happen in her family, her mother died, I think. She would show up. She would show up at the house, for instance, and come back and I'm seeing everybody, hugging, and everybody was, laughing, talk about all. She sat at the kitchen table and talk, and she would be around, 6, 7 hours, 8 hours. She's still there, and then she'd find maybe an old staff, no ex-resident or something, start talking, and it would come out something. This happened to her at least 4 times during the 13 years. She would bring up the fact that she either lost her boyfriend or one of their mothers died. It was different things, and then it would be about 3 or 4 hours of going through that. And then she'd wind up sleeping on the couch overnight and going to work till the next day, coming back. And I know a couple of times she would come back to Soteria at night and go to work, sleeping on the couch. She was never admitted, just, but that kind of support. And she, rather than, more likely a person like that, and any other system would be left out and wound up being hospitalized again.
Right, either be turned away.
Being able to use Soteria as just a sort of flop house for a lot of the ex-Soteria folks became volunteers, and several of them actually became staff.
Wow.
But and most of the folks who went to Soteria came by at least once or twice after they were discharged. And a lot of new folks who came in at new admissions would wind up making friends with somebody who was the ex-president hanging around, and wind up, when they leave, sharing a room with somebody else as a way out discharge.
Voyce, there's so much to talk about. We are, unfortunately, out of time. I really want to thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. It's been very fascinating to get a little bit of a glimpse into what Soteria House was all about.
It's hard to talk about it in an hour, but there's vast difference between the most models and Soteria, and I really appreciate you guys offering me this, because it's let me know there's somebody out there who's still aware of what we did back then, and still aware of other ways of approaching it.
Absolutely. We're trying to do what we can here at the Freedom Center in Northampton, and also there is a Soteria project that's getting rolling in Alaska.
Yes, I know. I saw that Jim. I wish I could have heard your station to hear Jim.
Jim Gottstein, last week.
Yeah, right.
We're going to have him coming on to talk about the new Soteria in Anchorage, Alaska, because it looks like they're close to getting state funding to basically create a new Soteria House in Anchorage, Alaska, based on the successful project that Voyce was involved in. Voyce, thank you very much for joining us.
Okay.
And it's good talking with you. And you're listening to WXOJ LP FM, Northampton 103.3 Valley Free Radio.